What's up, everybody? Welcome to your video lesson on the Civil War. So very much like we did in class, we will be going through this pretty fast. The Civil War is something that basically the seeds are planted for early on in the history of our country, whether that's from bringing slaves over to the sectional divisions between the North and the South. So we're going to be moving through this quick in order to get through it all, but just understand that the history of the Civil War is an extremely complicated one, and one that really has so many layers to it. So remember that with Bacon's Rebellion, to give a little context here, the shortcomings of indentured servitude get laid bare before the colonists and before Great Britain. So the idea of coming over as a white indentured servant from Great Britain, doing your time and then eventually getting your own land, that is working pretty well for the indentured servants, but for the people who eventually have to pay them, that's not working so well. And also, the more that time goes on, as we get into the late 1600s, indentured servants are wanting more and more of their due, and they don't feel like they are being protected from Native American tribes by Great Britain and that government. So they launched Bacon's Rebellion, led by Nathaniel Bacon. In this rebellion, they burned down a bunch of Virginia. They burned down the Jamestown settlement. And this leads to Great Britain saying, you know what, I think we need to stop doing this indentured servitude thing and just bring over more slaves. There were debates about slavery at the Constitutional Convention, but ultimately not much is settled there. As new states get added to the Union, there's going to be more and more debate about, are they free states or are they slave states? This happens with the Northwest Ordinance, which is where essentially the government lays out, as we establish states, we're going to have a set of rules for them to become states, but then also with the Missouri Compromise, which draws a line through the middle of America, north to south, and says slavery won't reach up past that point. Also remember that the cotton gin increased the need for slaves, so despite the fact that the slave trade ends in 1808, new slaves stop coming in, you're still going to have slaves who are born in America and continuing to have more and more of them. But by the 1800s, you do start to see a large swath of abolitionist movements. And a lot of these abolitionist movements are led by women. If you recall the Seneca Falls Convention, you've got women who are fighting for their right to vote. They're fighting for temperance. They're also fighting for the abolition of slavery as a moral evil. And a lot of that comes from the thinkers of the Second Great Awakening, when people are turning back to Christ and realizing that slavery is a sinful moral wrong. Remember that not every white landowner in the South had slaves. Actually, only about 1/4 of white landowners in the South had slaves, but there was some power to be gained from this system. So even non-slaveholders in the South tended to support slavery. There were 250,000 free blacks in the South, and much more than that in the North, who are leading abolitionist movements. They're helping out with the Underground Railroad in Harriet Tubman's case. And in the North, you have things like a newspaper called The Liberator, which is a newspaper that's being circulated to advocate for the abolition of slavery. So there are free blacks at this time, and they are doing things to try to help blacks still living in slavery in the South. A few of the really important and influential African Americans of this time would be Frederick Douglass, who wrote Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, who wrote her famous Ain't I a Woman speech, then Theodore Weld, who writes numerous pamphlets to sort of advocate for the abolition of slavery, and then William Lloyd Garrison, who publishes the first edition of The Liberator. Remember that slaves did resist. They resisted in indirect ways like slowdowns or breaking tools, or they resisted in their mind. They didn't buy into the things that they were being told, or they resisted directly through things like Nat Turner's Rebellion, which was when a preacher led slaves to kill their owners, or Stonos Rebellion, another slave rebellion that came before this time. But then there was also the Underground Railroad, and again, Harriet Tubman. Now, there was a vehement defense of slavery in the South, and this is so important to remember, that this defense of slavery usually sprung from an economic reason, right? The South's economy is built on cotton, king cotton, and slaves are needed as labor for that product. But also on top of that, you see some people who are starting to do almost this high-minded, in quotes here, defense of slavery with essentially saying that no, these slaves need the help of their white owners, right? So you also see some of that thinking there. One particularly strong defender of slavery is two-time Vice President John C. Calhoun, who argues that slavery is a positive good because in a lot of ways, these owners are helping the slaves in some sort of way. And it's also important to keep in mind that not everybody in the North supported abolition. A lot of people just in general did not support abolition. Some people, if they were trying to end slavery, it wasn't necessarily because they just cared that much. A lot of it was because they wanted slaves to be able to work maybe where they were so that they wouldn't move somewhere else and take the job of somebody. And then also there are people who, they just don't feel like this is their fight. And that's actually how Abraham Lincoln, whenever he first becomes president, early in his political career, he just feels like, yes, I would like for slaves to be free, but more than anything, I care about the preservation of the Union. So this abolitionist versus free soilers versus people who want, maybe they don't want slavery is because they don't actually want African Americans in their state, right? So it's very, very gray as far as the lines here. It's not that everybody either supports it or doesn't support it. There's a lot of room in the middle. Now remember, in the Mexican-American War, America is going to gain a ton of land in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That's going to add an extra 525,000 square miles to the United States territory, including parts of present-day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. And Mexico also gives up all claims to Texas. So that is a huge land gain for America, but the question becomes, what do we do with those states? Are they going to be slave or free? So Henry Clay, in the second major compromise of his political career, he also helped to broker the Missouri Compromise. He is going to broker the Compromise of 1850, which is going to essentially say, we're going to admit California as a free state. We are going to strengthen the fugitive slave law, which essentially means that if your slave in a slave state escapes to a free state, you can send someone out, a bounty hunter, to go and get them and bring them back out of that free state. Also, the Compromise of 1850 is going to give popular sovereignty to Utah and New Mexico on slavery. Popular sovereignty means that the citizens of the state get to choose for themselves. And then it's going to abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. It's also going to do a federal assumption of Texas's debt when they become a U.S. state. At this point, the situation in America is becoming untenable between pro-slavery factions and anti-slavery factions, and then everywhere in the middle. And that we are rapidly racing toward a split. So in the last attempts to compromise, you get the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is introduced by Stephen Douglas to pay the way for a northern transcontinental railroad. It proposes popular sovereignty to determine slavery in the Kansas and Nebraska territory, and it also overrides the Missouri Compromise. The only problem is that Kansas is not going to follow these rules very well, and that's going to lead to Bleeding Kansas, which is a statewide civil war. So in 1857, Kansas has enough people to apply for statehood. To keep abolitionists from creating a free state, the pro-slavery politicians create the Lecompton Constitution, and that aims to protect property already brought to Kansas regardless of the vote. That property, in this case, being slaves. This is going to lead to a major, massive 7-year fight in Kansas. One of these people who is going to be here fighting is going to be John Brown, who believed in the use of violent means to end slavery, and he's actually going to kill 5 pro-slavery settlers at one point. He and his sons will go and use extremely violent means to hopefully achieve the end of slavery. John Brown will be convicted of murder and treason by the court of Virginia, because that is where he came from. Now, a couple of important things to discuss as we, again, lead up to the Civil War. The first is Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe that talked in an emotional way and tried to give a real-life scenario of what slavery was like. And it kind of opened the eyes of Northerners who didn't realize how bad things actually were. So in the South, the treatment of African Americans is simply not seen by the North because we don't have cameras at this time. And so really that is the function that this book serves, to sort of give an insight to the real life of a slave. You've got the Dred Scott decision of 1857. So Dred Scott was a slave who lived with his master for 5 years in Illinois and Wisconsin territory and sued for his freedom based on his residence on free soil. But the ruling by the Supreme Court in Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857 said that black people are not citizens and can't sue in federal court. Property, and in this case being private property being a slave, can be taken to any territory and legally held there. The Fifth Amendment forbade Congress to deprive people of their property, essentially saying that if you have a slave, you can take them to a free state because they are your property. This is going to overturn previous compromises and limits on the extension of slavery into the territories. The Dred Scott decision is so crucially important. Now, as we get into the election of 1860, you're going to see that really this is where the Civil War starts. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln is going to run against a guy named Stephen Douglas for an Illinois Senate seat. Now, he's going to lose in the Illinois Senate, but in the process of losing to Douglas, Abraham Lincoln has a series of about 7 debates with Stephen Douglas on the subject, well, on a lot of subjects, but particularly on slavery. Abraham Lincoln is able to tie Stephen Douglas down to a few positions that are going to be unpopular for Douglas in the South. And the reason why that is important is because Abraham Lincoln is going to be able to win the North in the election of 1860, where he'll run against Stephen Douglas again, among others. But because of those positions that Douglas had to take in the debates, he is going to struggle in the South. And so now Abraham Lincoln, in a very, very contested contest, where in a lot of states in the South, Abraham Lincoln doesn't even show up, Abraham Lincoln will become president. At this, because the South is very concerned that Abraham Lincoln is going to abolish slavery, the South is going to secede, starting with South Carolina, who votes unanimously to secede from the Union. So Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas join, and they're going to form the Confederate States of America. They elect Jefferson Davis as the president of the new Confederacy. There is one last attempt to compromise after the secession has already happened with the Crittenden Compromise, which is to extend the 3630 line westward and protect slavery in a territorial stage. But Lincoln refuses this compromise and basically says that we can't compromise with you now. The first shots of the war are going to be fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. And ladies and gentlemen, we've got ourselves a Civil War. So Abraham Lincoln is now president. It's 1861. He wins the election of 1860. And Abraham Lincoln has really one major objective, and it is to keep the Union together. Lincoln even says that if he can keep the Union together by freeing the slaves, he'll do that. If he can keep the Union together by keeping slavery as it is, he'll do that. But he does famously say, a house divided against itself cannot stand. You can't have both free states and slave states. But remember that in a lot of tactical ways, the North has an advantage. The North is ahead as far as the value of their farmland, railway mileage. They have more manufacturing in the North. They have more workers in those manufacturing plants. Their manufacturing is more valuable. And this is going to be such an important tactical advantage for the North. They simply have more supplies that's going to allow them to sort of bleed dry or suck the life out of the Confederacy. That's actually going to be the Union strategy, Winfield Scott Great Snake or Anaconda strategy, which is essentially to encircle the South and cut it off from resources of the North. But even possibly more importantly, you have William Tecumseh Sherman's total war strategy, which is not really exaggerating at all, to scorch the earth. William Tecumseh's idea is, if you're going to have a war, it's actually more humane to make it short and brutal and terrible, and rather than stretching it out and having a long war that's not quite as bad. So William Tecumseh Sherman is going to be an advocate of total war, total scorching of the earth. Just take no prisoners, do whatever you need to do in order to win this war. And he's going to burn miles and miles of homes and farmland in the South. And to this day, William Tecumseh Sherman is remembered in the South for this. 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which declares that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. And this will actually come into effect after the war is over. So a few major battles of the war. 1861, you get the Battle of Bull Run, where the Union is forced to retreat. They shocked Northerners out of their complacency and prompted them to prepare for the struggle ahead, a morale boost for the South also. And that's really kind of what happens at Fort Sumter. It's a little bit surprising for the North how serious the South is going to be about this. Then 1862, you've got the Battle of Antietam. You've got General Lee, who is the head of the Confederate States. He makes an aggressive push into the border states to try to defeat the Union on its own turf. This is the bloodiest single day. The Confederates retreat. McClellan fails to pursue Lee and is replaced by Grant. This is one thing that Abraham Lincoln is going to be known to do, is to move his generals around a little bit until he gets the guy he wants in Ulysses S. Grant, who will be the head of the Union Army. 1863, you've got Vicksburg. This gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, so crucial for trade and transport. 1863, also you've got Gettysburg, where Lee marches into Pennsylvania. At the end of a bloody 3-day struggle, more than 50,000 men died. 1864 in Atlanta, William Tecumseh Sherman defeats the Confederate troops. He burns the city and then marches on to Savannah. Along the way, he destroys railroads, burns homes and crops, and loots and pillages, and this helps Lincoln secure re-election, the popularity that comes out of the Atlanta campaign. Then in 1863, you've got the Gettysburg Address, which is a major rallying point for the Union Army. But just keep in mind a couple of important things here. 1864, Lincoln does win re-election, very, very important. He went in an electoral landslide, but not necessarily a popular vote landslide. In the end, whenever this war ends, the Union is going to benefit from tariffs that they place on outside imports. There are going to be more opportunities for women in the North. There also is going to be, because there are no Southern senators or congressmen, the North is going to be able to do pretty much whatever they want politically, including passing the Morrill Act, which includes land grants for colleges, the Pacific Railroad Act, and also the Homestead Act, which is going to be a massively important act that provides settlers 160 acres of free land if they are willing to move west and claim it. Now for the Confederacy, you get dramatic inflation, and you also get a Union blockade that kind of slowly starves out the South. Also, this is going to demolish Southern land. This is killer on Southern land because of the war being fought there. Sherman is also famous for destroying land as he goes, houses as he goes. Already weak transportation system in the South is going to collapse. $2 billion in slaves are going to be emancipated. Now, the end of the war, the Union is basically going to outsupply and outlast the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse, and 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln is going to be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. That, again, is 1865, the end of the war, and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So that's all I've got for you on the Civil War. If you have any questions, please let me know. Only Jesus!